So when it reaches the right temperature, just touch it up and down the tip to see if it melts. You can see it's melting and it's beading. The most important thing here is we're getting the flux to flow over the core. Some of the solder is not sticking, but that's okay at this point. If we then bring in some of this brass and just gently push and twist, what we're trying to do is just get a little bit of that tinning. See how it's now stuck to the surface, and that's what will help the solder to flow. All right, if you want to come over here now take this magnifier out the way, but the magnifier is good when you're trying to see what's going on. Good to use this thing called a third hand, where you can actually hold the wire and then have your two hands free in order to be able to apply solder and the tip. Now the trick to this is you don't really have to heat the wire up that you're soldering on first. The trick is you will actually be touching the solder onto the tip to get it flowing, and once it's flowing you keep feeding it in and move the solder and the soldering iron down the item that you're trying to solder onto, and you'll know that it's flowing because you'll get a nice shiny solder bead appearing. There it is now, it just went nice and shiny, and that's all that's needed. Okay, so the trick is not holding it on the thing you want to solder for a long period of time. It's bringing the soldering iron up and you feed the solder into the gap between the soldering iron and the object. When the solder starts melting, you then touch the soldering iron on the object you're wanting it to flow, and you just move it away, and that's now prepared. And then I just drag away. And that's now just left a coating of both solder and some flux there, ready for me to solder it onto something. Okay, now that we've got the wire ready to solder, we've got a nice healthy bit of solder on the wire, and we're actually going to solder this to the tip of this motor terminal. Now, if we apply too much heat to the motor terminal, we'll melt all the plastic around it, which we don't want to do. So the key to setting this up is using the helping hands, these two clips, to hold the item that you're soldering in an angle and a position that lets you hold the wire where you want it, which would be either slightly above like that or slightly below like that, and then you can bring your solder in on one side and the soldering iron in on the other. The setup is the critical bit. If you get that right, you'll only have to apply heat for literally 1 or 2 seconds and you'll be good to go. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use a third helping hand that I've got over here to hold my wire in position. And the trick is to get it just resting that end of that wire at the right angle, so that when I finish the solder, it's not going to pull away. There is a slight little hole in that terminal, so what I'm going to do is put a little bead of solder into that hole so I've got something to work from. So same principle here. I'm going to bring the soldering tip up just underneath. There's a gap. I'm going to start the solder melting onto the gap and then bring the soldering iron into that space and then try and see if I can fill that hole. It looked like it didn't quite run. That's better now, and there we've done. So now we've got a nice solid bead, and that was by, remember, melting onto the tip first, then bringing the tip and the solder and continue feeding the solder in. Right, now that we've got that in place, I'll put the soldering iron over here while I now line up these, and this is the critical bit. Can I hold, because you need 3 hands for this, can I hold this wire in position so that as I bring the two items together, the solder will just quickly melt them in and you'll end up with a nice strong connection. So what I'm going to do here, because I can't get the wire to quite stay in position, I'm going to use my left hand to hold it touching just as I want, and I'm hoping that the extra amount of solder that I left on both will have just enough flux in it so when I touch the two together, which I'm bringing it in now to do, that I can apply just enough heat to both. It's proving a bit fiddly. Just enough heat to both to get them to run together. Let's see if this is going to play ball. There it is, and it's flowed beautifully. You want to hold it still and ideally I would have a little fan running so that the air would cool that. And as soon as it goes slightly dull, you'll find that the solder has now become quite strong, and that's quite a firm thing. Be careful not to move it backwards and forwards though, because you can snap the brass terminal off, and then the copper terminal I should say, and then it'll actually break. But that's a really good quality solid connection there.